Welcome to Path to the Great War. This is Melinda Cole Klein. The world must be made safe for democracy, stated President Woodrow Wilson in 1917. This president was the peacekeeper and diplomat, the one remembered because he kept us out of the war. His re-election slogan of 1916. As the world watched that summer and into fall of 1914, victory to either side did not come. This war, as expected, should have been over by Christmas, but it was not. The war instead turned into a prolonged struggle for territory and world power. While men rushed to enlist in Europe to defend their homeland and fight for king and country, Americans openly debated whether or not to fight. Thus, this nation would remain neutral for close to 3 years. However, the government, along with American banks and business interests, made hefty profits by supplying Europeans before and during the war with manufactured goods. Woodrow Wilson had become President of the United States in 1912 after a landslide victory. A Democrat, Wilson held a PhD in history, had been a professor at Princeton, and later the university's president. Born in Virginia to Confederate parents, Wilson became the first Southern president elected to hold office since the American Civil War. Woodrow Wilson's foreign affairs were firmly grounded in the belief that democracy and capitalism would foster peace and world prosperity, and the U.S. should be the leading example to the world. For decades, the arms race in Europe had created tensions between nations, while they had been quietly securing alliances as the newly unified nation of Germany seemed determined to exercise her military might. As for the United States, Americans sought neutrality from this conflict that would erupt yet again in Europe. In recent memory, after the Napoleonic Wars, conflict continued with the Crimean War, then the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. Neighboring countries found territorial boundaries redrawn as Germany, unified in 1871, began to confiscate duchies and principalities. While America finished its short war with Spain, and the British fought in South Africa in the Boer War, the Russians and Japanese battled for territories in China, to which Russia was humiliated in short order. To Americans, 1914 seemed to be another one of those conflicts between the powers of Europe, seen time and time again. American politics and its relation to the outside world would be reshaped by the Great War. Lessons from this war would bring America into international politics, as her place within it would make the world, one could only hope, a better place. While European powers had been busy with an arms race, the United States contributed to this conflict through business ventures in which they would sell supplies and military equipment to the highest bidder. By 1914, the United States exported a total of $754 million in manufactured goods. 2 years into the war, this number grew exponentially to $2.75 billion. To Germany, U.S. businesses sold about $190 million worth of supplies. Likely after 1914, this trend would have continued, but in a wise move, the British imposed an embargo against U.S. trade with Germany. It is not a surprise that commentators on the 1915 sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania, sailing from New York to London, highlighted the tragic loss of over 1,200 passengers. But newspapers had for months ran cautionary ads that to travel the Atlantic during wartime was dangerous. And this zone of war included the waters off the coast of the British Isles. While the lucrative trade in arms and supplies originating from America was a little-known fact, the sinking of the Lusitania and the discovery of ammunition on board brought this controversial issue to American readers. In part, Germany was perhaps justified to torpedo the Lusitania. Nonetheless, it was a passenger liner, but this was war. This incident did not, by itself, bring America into the war. In May 1915, a German submarine fired a torpedo into the British liner Lusitania off the Irish coast. The vessel sank quickly, killing passengers, including 128 Americans. With American economic motivations focused on trade with Europe, this was not the moment for Congress to enter the war. Meanwhile, President Wilson reacted by stating Germany needed to be held accountable for this action. Once the event calmed down, it was decided that the best course of action would be for the U.S. to remain neutral. In his argument, Wilson defended the right of neutral countries to travel where they liked. Nor was he willing to stop American trade or travel in general. This war would create unforeseen consequences that would shape the modern world we live in today. While the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, did not keep the peace for long, this war would create new nation-states out of monarchies, while the 1917 revolution in Russia would bring to power a new form of government called communism. In this total war, the Allied powers led by Britain, France, Russia, and Serbia, and later Italy and the United States, defeated the Central Powers led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Unified only since 1871, the German Empire, under the leadership of their monarch, Kaiser Wilhelm II, would find their monarch deposed and their government defeated. The new German government that would assume power in place of the monarchy would be remembered in history as the short-lived Weimar Republic. While Germany had possessed a weak parliament under the monarchy, it had little experience with representative democracy in a scale required under the terms of peace in the Treaty of Versailles. Reluctantly, German politicians of the Weimar Republic would surrender to the Allied forces and their terms of peace by 1919. After the presence of the invading Mongols had faded by the end of the 1200s, this enabled the Ottoman Empire to create a government for its Muslim Turk population. In time, this empire spread into former territories that had belonged to the Roman and Byzantine empires. Ultimately, the Greek Orthodox Christian nation of Byzantium would be conquered by Ottoman Turks in the name of Islam. In the climactic battle for the capital city, Constantinople, sadly for the West, in 1453, the empire fell to invading forces. During the Great War, the weakened Ottoman monarchy would be deposed, and a political movement during an independence moment would lead to the founding of the Republic of Turkey by 1923. The Empire of Austria-Hungary had been created after Napoleon would bring an end to the Holy Roman Empire by 1808. By the 1860s, the royal families of Austria and Hungary united in a political and territorial alliance. The Habsburg family would rule this empire, as predecessors had served as emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. This family dynasty history dates back to the 1100s or more, becoming one of the most powerful families in Europe. As enemy combatants during the Great War, terms of peace established in 1918 ended the monarchy and divided its territory into various modern nations. The monarchy of Russia came to an end during this war, but it was not because Russia was considered a threat to the Allies. Western European powers had considered Russia as a likely enemy, but during this war, Russia became an ally. Unfortunately for the Russian monarchy, led by the Romanov family dynasty, Tsar Nicholas for years had resisted the Western political and social influences his people clamored for over the course of decades. In fear for his family, the royals remained in seclusion for years. In time, a revolutionary presence would fight for political control. From 1917, the Empire of Russia would fall as the result of the Bolshevik Revolution that overthrew the monarchy. While Allied nations would celebrate the victory from the date of the armistice, 11 November 1918, Russia remained embroiled in a revolution that in a time would bring communism as a government form into being. By the early 1900s, the countries of Europe were becoming increasingly hostile. Britain, France, and Germany competed economically, while Austria-Hungary and Russia both tried to dominate the Balkan states of Southeast Europe. Meanwhile, imperial nations competed for available territories around the world. In 1912 through 1913, two major wars broke out in the Balkan states. Europeans watched with hopefulness they would succeed when lands controlled by the Ottoman Empire would be ripe for the picking. By 1914, Germany was losing the arms race with Britain, and it seemed their window of opportunity for a preemptive strike had closed. European alliances that had been taking shape for decades resulted in solidifying political ties. Once Austria declared war on Serbia, diplomacy suffered. The assassination by terrorists of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria created an international incident. The German government promptly intervened to protect the pride and honor of Austria, a longtime political ally. A month after the assassination, Austria declared war on Serbia, blamed for the assassination itself. Germany backed this move, as it was rumored by the end of July, Russia had mobilized troops to protect Serbia against their aggressive neighbors who, like other Europeans, wanted to create colonies in the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire. Post-war archival evidence has shown German policymakers at the highest levels believed in 1914 the time had come for a preemptive strike. This moment convinced Germans to gamble that Britain would not enter the war to protect her allies. This Third Balkan War rapidly turned into a European war because of alliances in place by 1914. By December 1914, a network of trenches stretched along the Western Front from the Belgian coast in the north down through eastern France to the Swiss border, an approximate distance of 400 miles to the south. Trenches bordering France were believed to be a temporary solution in efforts to provide minimum cover from enemy fire. But Germany underestimated French military effectiveness. All the while, with similar technology and military standards, oftentimes battles ended in stalemate. Massive loss in life to all sides, with little territory claimed by the aggressor. Daytime in the trenches alternated between extreme fear and boredom. Most work was done at night when patrols were sent out to spy on enemy camps and sometimes raid them if possible. At the same time, damaged trench areas needed repair and reinforcement before another attack. The most likely times for attack were dawn to dusk. Days were usually quiet, so men tried to catch up on sleep and to write letters home to loved ones. They also wrote poems, painted, and made sketches about their experiences at the front. There were no set meal times on the front line. Every 10 days, Allied troops left the front lines in a rotated order between reserve lines who took their place. This enabled men, at least in the beginning of the war, to get a break and change their clothes. But as the war raged on, the Allies had to deal with more than the Germans. The muddy, cold, and wet conditions in French trenches, often 2 feet deep in mud, especially during the winter and colder months, challenged soldiers to the core. When troops left the trenches to advance to enemy front lines, they entered a place called No Man's Land, an area between 2 enemy fronts, difficult to pass for either with barbed wire fencing. Never knowing when someone from the enemy camp might be bold or crazy enough to traverse No Man's Land, this kept every soldier in the trenches in a state of alert, never knowing when they may be attacked with artillery fire as well. Since soldiers were so used to enemy fire over time, and that flying around them, warning signs were actually posted that reminded soldiers to keep their heads down. As the Ottoman Empire was one of the Central Powers, they had to be defeated. Thus, major conflicts took place in the Middle East. Here, the Turkish Ottoman Empire controlled Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Arabia, to which the British, French, and Arab allies fought brutally. British troops invaded Mesopotamia, this is Iraq, in 1914. After 3 years of fighting in the desert, British forces finally captured Baghdad in 1917. By October 1918, Arab troops had entered Damascus. Bedouin soldiers, under the guidance of T.E. Lawrence, rose in revolt against their Turkish rulers and waged a guerrilla campaign for an independent Arab state. Lawrence first visited the Middle East in 1909 and learned to speak Arabic. In 1914, he became an Army intelligence officer stationed in Cairo, Egypt. Later, he worked as a liaison officer to to Arab revolutionaries against the Ottoman Turkish rule. Lawrence helped the Arabs to become an effective guerrilla force, blowing up railroad lines, attacking Turkish garrisons, and tying down an army many times their size. The Ottoman Empire would be dissolved by Allied powers after the war. However, the nation-state of Turkey, unlike her Middle Eastern counterparts, would remain independent of European rule. As Turkey had pulled free from the Ottoman Empire, its new government sought terms for independence. By 1923, Turkey had become a republic with a democratic-style government. Turkey's admired first president, Ataturk, would bring his people into the modern age. This government, under Ataturk's leadership, would adopt Western customs, such as the three-piece suit, abolishing the veil of women, and under law offering them freedoms unknown in Muslim countries. Other national reforms, which were many, some included the adoption of the Arabian alphabet, which we use, along with economic, judicial, and political ideals. From 1914 to 1917, President Wilson tried to keep America out of the war by concentrating his efforts on peacekeeping and international diplomacy, designed to enable peace between the Allies and the German alliance. In 1916, Wilson had won re-election. He won a second term because while the U.S. supported and supplied Allied countries, Wilson kept men and women soldiers at home. By 1916, foreign relations with Britain had soured because of the way the Royal Navy interfered with American shipping and its trade efforts with Germany, as mentioned. But American loans were granted to Britain. While Wilson tried to negotiate for peace with the British and the French in 1916, this peace settlement was refused. The Allied countries believed that, quote, solution would have to be settled on the battlefield. 1916 was a most difficult war year. The Battle of Verdun stands as a testament to this time and the state of the war in Europe. On February 21, 1916, Germany launched a massive attack against Verdun, a fortified French city. Verdun was close to the German border and controlled access to eastern France. After an 8-hour artillery bombardment, the German infantry advanced. French soldiers were caught by surprise and lost control of some of the main forts, but during the summer their resistance stiffened. By December of 1916, the Germans had been pushed back almost to where they had started. The cost to both sides in regards to lives was enormous. Casualties number close to 400,000 for the French and 831,000 Germans. This battle and the Battle of the Somme that followed were mass slaughters. Local people and outlying villages were attacked and captured, and their village destroyed in the wake of German advances. The battles of 1916 into 1917 proved to be a stalemate for each side. No one was the victor, and the battles at sea proved inconclusive as well. While Americans vied to remain neutral in this war, this feature would change quickly once Congress was convinced war might spread to our shores. While Americans sought to remain neutral, Germany would change its tactics on the high seas. In 1917, the official naval policy from Germany resumed a position in which submarines would attack all vessels without reservations, thus unrestricted enemy action. This policy smacked right in the face of American trade and commercial policies in which the president argued American trade should continue. Then in 1917, a second incident brought the president closer to a plan that would mean entering the war. The political situation with American allies would be significantly altered by 1917. The British had decoded communication from German intelligence to Mexican authorities. Deciphered by the British, the telegram confirmed the invitation by Germany that Mexico's alliance, when needed, would strike the United States. In the German pleas for alliance, Mexico's officials were reminded that they could reassume control of Texas, New Mexico, California, and other lands as they saw fit. To sweeten the deal, Germany would finance Mexico's war to distract America long enough so Germany could win the war in Europe. Once the British government shared this information with the White House, this proved to be sufficient information for the President and Congress to take action. On April 6, 1917, the U.S. government declared war on Germany. Once the draft was in place, 2.8 million American troops, known to history as doughboys, would be deployed to support the efforts of our European allies. America's entrance into the war was enough to shift the balance in favor of the Allies. By October 1918, the war was over, with Kaiser Wilhelm II fleeing Germany, and the new German government signed an armistice. On November 11th, at 11 a.m., the guns on the Western Front went silent. President Woodrow Wilson is remembered as contributing to the terms of peace negotiated in his 14 points. However, final features assigned German guilt for starting the war. As war reparations, Germany had to give back the territory of Alsace-Lorraine and pay $33 billion. Most of this money came in the form of loans secured from American banks. German representatives reluctantly signed the treaty on June 28, 1919. If you look at this date closely, you'll notice this is 5 years after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. This agreement was punitive. It left Germany humiliated. However, the nation was largely intact as an industrial power, while it had serious restrictions on their military power and authority. When men went off to fight, the women were called upon to take their place on the home front. Many women were already working as nurses, teachers, on their home family farms, or as laborers. Society deemed these roles suitable for women, but nations were at war. Now women went to factories, drove trucks and ambulances, and did almost anything a man did before the war. Women left their low-income clerical jobs too, to work in munitions factories and other industrial pursuits that brought them social attention. But the gains by women were short-lived. When the war ended, women returned to their appropriate roles as wives, mothers, and their pre-war occupations. During the war in Russia, women joined to fight for their country, although many of them died in battle against German aggression. For some women, war was an adventure. Courageous women volunteers from Britain and France set up bakeries in and near the French front lines to bake bread for the troops. Others volunteered to wash the laundry of troop regiments throughout the war or become frontline nurses. Meanwhile, at home, women had to take full control over their home economy. On farms in France, Britain, and across Europe, allied or enemy, women plowed fields, planted and harvested crops, while they hoped the war would end soon and their loved ones would return home. It is argued that the influenza of 1918 began in America, and once troops were shipped overseas, the deadly virus spread. President Wilson knew that some of his doughboys were carrying this disease, but troops had to be moved around the nation and to destinations abroad. The president chose to send the troops after weighing the option of keeping them at home. World peace was at stake. In the United States, over an 8-month period until November, it killed about 675,000 Americans, about the same number that died in the American Civil War. The flu virus spread rapidly, mutated, and was easily transferable from one person to another. As other flu viruses, this was possible just by being in the same room with an infected person, by breathing the same air. Coughing and sneezing spread it quickly from one person to another. A substrain of H1N1, also known as the swine flu, this disease eventually killed between 30 to 50 million, or perhaps as high as 100 million people in the world. At the same time, efforts to end the epidemic really did not do any good. People wore masks, but a virus is so small, this had no effect. The influenza epidemic was such an event it altered American behavior during the last months of the war. Violence and panic erupted in cities across the nation as the people died so quickly and caskets became scarce for a while. However, in time, the people who had lived through it became immune. When the war broke out in 1914, airplanes were mainly used by private individuals and not considered useful to state governments. At first, military leaders could not see how aircraft could be used in war, but soon they changed their minds. The first airplanes were reconnaissance craft, looking down on enemy positions or helping to direct artillery fire. When enemy fire tried to shoot scouting planes down, this led to dogfights in the air. By the end of the war, airplane technology had produced agile crafts that made sharp turns at high speeds. Airplanes even took pictures of enemy front lines using photography. Oftentimes, pilots flew at night, which had obvious dangers. Another new member to the air was the Zeppelin that came into the war by 1915. These German airships flew over cities and caused panic because at any moment they could release bombs. Additionally, they flew very high, thus out of range of ground artillery. But soon, higher flying airplanes brought these bombers down. All the while, most Zeppelins were used for naval reconnaissance. The British tank was invented in 1916, but it was not until 1917 that its potential was fully realized. By then, it was too late, at least for this war. From 1906, women's fashions were changing. French fashion trends brought in the age of the flapper, straight-line dressing with no corsets, the flat-chested, ultra-thin, no hips, no cleavage look that was all the rage. While these fashions began to become more popular during the 1910s, it was not until after the war women dress dramatically changed. In the post-war years, fashions lacked corsets, cleavage, and tight restricted dressing, as this became passé and unpopular. Filmmaking took a huge leap during the war and afterwards, and with it brought crowds to movie theaters, made affordable for the working class. For medicine, important advances in technology included the X-ray machine and the science of bacteriology.